am Raghavendra. Today I am going to present a seminar on triggers. So first we know what is triggers. Triggers are procedures stored in TLbar SQL or Java that run implicitly whenever a table or view is modified or when some user actions or database system action occurs. So now we see the contents of this seminar. These are the content of our seminar. First, introduction to trigger, components of a trigger, types of triggers and triggers executions. As I told earlier that this is the definition of the trigger. So first we can write triggers that fire whenever one of the following operations occurs. The first, DML statements means insert, update or delete kinds of things on a particular table or view issued by any user. The second thing is DDL statements means create or alter, so issued either by a particular schema or user or by any schema or user in the database. The third thing is database events such as a logon or log off, errors or startup or shutdown, also issued either by a particular schema or user or by any schema or user in the database. However, procedures or triggers differ in the way that they are invoked. A procedure is explicitly run by a user, applications or trigger. Triggers are implicitly fired by Oracle database when a triggering event occurs, no matter which user is connected or which application is being used. So this figure shows a database application with some SQL statements that implicitly fire several triggers stored in the database. Notice that the database stores triggers separately from their associate tables. So now we see how triggers are used. So triggers supplement the standard capabilities of Oracle database to provide a highly customized database management system. For example, a trigger can restrict DML operation against a table to those issued during regular business hours. You can also use triggers to many of the things. The first one is automatically generate derived column values and prevent invalid transactions, enforce complex security authorizations, and enforce referential integrity across nodes in a distributed database. Also enforce complex business rules, provide a transparent event logging, and provide auditing, maintain synchronous table replicates, gather statistics on table access, modify table data when DML statements are issued against views, and also finally publish information about database events, user events and SQL statements to subscribe applications. So let's see components of a trigger. A trigger has three basic components, each explained in this section. The first one is the trigger event or statement, and second one the trigger restrictions. The third one is trigger action. So before going to explain all those components, first we see this figure. This figure represents each of these trigger components and is not meant to show exactly syntax. The section that follow explain each trigger component is greater detail. Actually this figure is the recorder trigger. So the first one is a triggering event or statement component. A triggering event is the SQL statement or database event or a user event that causes a trigger to fire. A triggering event can be one or more of the following: an insert, update or delete statement on a specific table or view in some cases. Okay. Second one is a create, alter or drop statement on any schema object, a database startup or instance shutdown, and a specific error message or any error message, a user log on or log off. For example, the trigger statement is update of parts on hand on inventory. This statement means that when the parts on hand column of a row in the inventory table is updated, fire the trigger. When the triggering event is an update statement, you can include a column list to identify which column must be updated to fire the trigger. You cannot specify a column list for insert and delete statements because they affect entire rows of information. So now let's see trigger restriction. A trigger restriction specifies a Boolean expression that must be true for the trigger to fire. The trigger action is not run if the trigger restriction evaluates to false or unknown. In the example, the trigger restriction is new.parts underscore on underscore hand is less than new.reorder underscore point. Consequently, the trigger doesn't fire unless the number of available parts is less than present reorder amount. So now we see trigger action. A trigger action is the procedure that contains the SQL statements and code to be run when the following events occur. The first one is that a triggering statement is issued or the trigger restriction evaluates to true. Now we see types of triggers. The first one is row triggers and statement triggers. Second one is before and after triggers. Third one is compound triggers. The fourth type is instead of triggers. And the fifth and the final type is triggers on system events and user events. The first we see row trigger is fired each time the table is affected by the trigger statement. For example, if an update statement updates multiple rows of a table, a row trigger is fired once for each row affected by the update statements. If a triggering statement affects no rows, a row trigger is not run. So next we see a statement trigger is fired once on behalf of the triggering statement, regardless of the number of rows in the table that the triggering statement affects, even if no rows are affected. For example, if a delete statement deletes several rows from a table, a statement level delete trigger is fired only once. Before trigger means before triggers run the trigger action before the triggering statement is run. This type of trigger is commonly used in the following situations. When the trigger action determines whether the triggering statement should be allowed to complete using a before trigger. For this purpose, you can eliminate unnecessary processing of the triggering statement and its eventual rollback in cases where an exception is raised in the trigger action. And second is to derive specific column values before completing a triggering inserted update statement. And after trigger means it runs the trigger action after the triggering statement is run. Compound triggers is a single trigger on a table that enables you to specify action for each of 4 timing points. The first one is before the firing statement. The second one is before each row that the firing statement affects. The third one is after each row that the firing statement affects. The fourth one is after the firing statement. So now we see instead of trigger. So instead of trigger provides a transparent way of modifying views that cannot be modified directly through DML statements. These triggers are invoked instead of trigger because unlike other types of triggers, Oracle database fires the trigger instead of executing the trigger statements. So now we see triggers on system events and user events. The system events include database startup and shutdown, data guard role transitions, and server error message events. And the user events includes user log on and log off. DDL statements means create, alter, drop, and DML statement means includes insert, delete, and update. Finally, we see trigger execution. A trigger is either enabled or disabled. The figure it shows the trigger modes. The trigger mode, if trigger mode is enabled means an enabled trigger runs its trigger action if a triggering statement is issued and the trigger restriction, if any there, means it evaluates to true. If it disabled means a trigger doesn't run its trigger action even if a trigger string statement is issued and the trigger restriction would evaluate to true. Thank you. This is my end of seminar.